Good morning, Callum.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad that we're having a recorded conversation for the first time. I know, in fact, we actually Zoomed before you actually wrote your earlier piece, didn't we? If I remember.
We had a bit of a check-in. I think I had a bit too much sherry, if I remember.
You never have too much sherry. It's a really underrated beverage. I see you're on the coffee this morning, though. At least that looks like coffee.
It is coffee. It's a bit too early for sherry.
I'm also on the coffee. I kind of wish I was drinking, that scene in Modesty Blaze, which I know we're going to talk about in a bit, where Dirk Bogarde has that giant glass with a goldfish swimming in the bottom of it.
You wish you were drinking a goldfish?
No, I don't want. No. Everyone knows I am dead set against animal cruelty, so I am not going to. No. Anyway, I'm just going to dig myself out of that hole quickly. So anyway, we're here to talk about Dirk Bogarde, aren't we? But yes. First of all, before we get to Dirk Bogarde, let's talk about you. So who are you?
Okay.
For those who don't know.
My name's Callum. I am a Bond fan, obviously. I'm 26. I identify as a gay cis man. In my day job, I'm a features editor on a history magazine. So I do a lot of writing. I'm quite interested in kind of history. Yeah, I'm basically a Bogarde fan as well, which I'm sure we'll dig into momentarily.
So if you don't already recognize Callum, he has already written one article for Licensed to Queer, which is absolutely brilliant exploration of how Bond has a lot of conventions of horror movies. A really, really well-received article. Lots of really nice comments about that people hadn't seen Bond in that way before, which is something that I think Licensed to Queer is really good at doing. Everyone who writes for the website that we always get that sort of feedback. So that was really, really nice. And it made me personally view certain parts of Bond in a different way as well. So thank you for writing that earlier piece. And then when you came up with the idea for the piece that we're going to be talking about today, I was like, oh, it's another one of those opportunities for me to learn an awful lot myself, because I don't know that much about Dirk Bogarde. Before we just started recording, I was trying to reel off the films I've seen with Dirk Bogarde in, and I know it's more than 3, but the 3 spring to mind. And as a result of reading your article, actually, you've sent me down a bit of a Dirk Bogarde rabbit hole. So I actually found in a charity shop one of his volumes of autobiography. So have you, I'm sure you reference a lot of his own personal writings. Have you actually embarked upon any of his books?
I actually have a collection of his autobiographies. The funny story is that I asked for the first 4, and my brother got a book from the 80s for me for my birthday, and it said complete and unabridged. The problem was that was before he then wrote the last 4, because he wrote 8 volumes. And my little brother was a bit shocked by that. It was like, oh, how much does he have to write about himself? So he did write quite a lot, but I've read the first 2 and read his collected letters and a few other books. He was quite a prolific writer.
Yeah,
his career.
I think this is volume 6. So I haven't read any of the others. I'm not sure I need to read volumes 1 to 5 before reading that, but I am looking forward to, when I get through a couple of other items on my to read pile, I'm going to look forward to reading that. So for anyone who doesn't know Dirk Bogarde, because although he was a household name for many decades while he was working, and a lot of people will have heard the name, but can maybe picture him. There's a photo that keeps doing the rounds on social media at the moment of him in tight leather trousers, which is taken from the film. It's the DVD copies up there. It's taken from a film which I only got around to watching a couple of years ago myself, and I as a massive Western fan, it'd been one I'd always wanted to see. Although it's the weirdest Western you can imagine, a British Western shot in, is it somewhere in Spain?
Yeah,
so sort of like spaghetti Western sort of aesthetic, but incredibly homoerotic, just deeply, bizarrely, compellingly weird film. So that's one of the things that I think of, and a lot of people probably think of when they think of Dirk Bogarde, even if they haven't had the pleasure of watching the singer, not the song. So tell us a bit about Dirk Bogarde and why we should really be interested in him.
So he was born in 1921, and he kind of rose to prominence in the 1950s, working for the Rank Studios, which was kind of a really sort of big British studios at the time. He was under contract, and he became kind of a matinee idol. So he was at one point the most popular film star in England, particularly for a series of films he did, starting with Doctor in the House, which were kind of light comedy, sort of pre Carry On, not quite as lewd.
Right.
They were.
I haven't seen any of those. Are they worth watching?
They're interesting. I mean, they're very, very problematic. They're not aged well. There's some very problematic elements. There's use of blackface in the first film.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, I think it's really up to people if they're comfortable kind of material. But they are quite funny in other ways, and it's interesting to see him do light comedy because that's what he was known for. Towards the end of the 50s, there's a sense of him becoming a bit. I believe he was in his 40s at that point, and he is on the front cover of kind of magazines aimed towards teenage girls. And he was very much of this kind of mind, well, I'm going to age out of this, and I need to find something more serious. In the 60s, he kind of branches into, I guess, more serious cinema, and he works with a lot of kind of art house directors. He works with Visconti. In the 70s, his last film was with Fassbinder, and he makes a lot of films with Joseph Losey, who is a American director who had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era. And so he kind of then makes a lot more very well sort of thought films, but in doing so, he's not so much the draw anymore. He's kind of aged out of that. But he's, in terms of why people should be interested in him, I think because one of the things I like about him is it kind of explains why people may not know him, or may not be a household name, is that there's an ownership of his films. He very rarely, as far as I can think, plays supporting roles. There's a handful of films, Darling, Bridge Too Far, in which he has kind of a supporting role. A fourth film I've seen with Dirk Bogarde. I forgot, because there's so many people in A Bridge Too Far, I actually forgot he was in it. But that's sort of the interesting thing with him. Quite often, he doesn't sort of pop up alongside of the names. Quite often, it's the leader. There's a real ownership of his films, and so seeing most of his movies, it's because I was looking for Dirk Bogarde films. Yeah. So once you kind of open that manhole, crawl down it, then you're going to just keep going. You're going to find lots of stuff. It's interesting stuff that might interest you, that you've maybe not heard of. But I think it's perhaps not as accessible because you kind of have to really just start looking for Dirk Bogarde films. It's not likely that you're going to happen upon them. No, I'm not sure they're shown much on TV anymore, except for like Bridge Too Far, which is some type like the bleakest bank holiday film ITV can possibly put on. The longest as well, isn't it? Isn't it like 4 hours? It's quite long. I really enjoy Bridge Too Far because I like that kind of campaign in World War II, Operation Market Garden. I found it fascinating. It was also the subject of a really good video game. So I like A Bridge Too Far, but I know it's a bit of an acquired taste. But you're right, you don't often see Dirk Bogarde films coming up on TV, apart from if it's Talking Pictures TV, one of my favorite stations. That's probably your safest bet. One of the films I have seen with Dirk Bogarde, and I find it fascinating that many of the heartthrobs, and that point you've just made about him being on teenage girl magazine covers, it's really interesting because so many heartthrobs in the 50s and 60s were actually closeted gay men. Like I'm thinking Rock Hudson, for instance, in the US. So I find it, I'm right in saying, from having read your article, I learned this, that he never actually came out as gay in his life.
but other people have confirmed that he was. And we always have to be really careful here, don't we? And you, especially as a writer of history, you must come across this all the time. So how do you kind of resolve that dilemma? Because we're going to talk about him as a gay man, which, you know, there's not a shred of ambiguity there, I don't think, but he never came out as gay himself. So how do you approach that?
I guess for me, it's always acknowledge it. If there's ever any doubt, acknowledge that, say it. I did have a bit of a dilemma in writing the article, in that I say that I relate to him. And one of the ways I relate to him is that he's quite private. And I can be quite private at times. And I did have a dilemma when approaching that. I'm thinking, well, I'm discussing his private life, and here I am saying that I sympathize with him because I like my privacy too. So that was a bit of a dilemma. But in terms of approaching how to talk about him as a gay man, I think I acknowledge that he came out that he was actually, until his death, he was brought up quite a lot in interviews, and he was quite sort of firm and used to get quite funny about it. But I think you just have to acknowledge the evidence that there is, acknowledge the evidence that goes against the point you want to make. But there is a lot of people out there who have said, family members. There was a BBC documentary, a really good documentary called "The Private Life of Dirk Bogarde," and in that they tell some stories. They acknowledge that he most likely was. And I think that's the thing. It's like, back up your sources, get as much evidence as you can. And then on the other hand, just acknowledge that they weren't. And I think respect is the other thing as well with a lot of these actors who weren't, or personalities in general, who just weren't out at the time. But we now have discovered more detail from. You are dealing with someone's private letters or a family member's kind of interview. I think it's just treating them with respect and approaching them with that level of respect, because they wouldn't have wanted information now.
Yeah, the audio is just going a bit quiet there, Callum. I don't know if yeah, there you go. I think we're back. Just to reinforce that, and as you know, as a queer historian, and although I'm not anywhere near as qualified as yourself, I'm an amateur historian. It's often you see people referred to as friends, and acquaintances, and even though all the evidence suggests that there is a romantic relationship there, yeah, I mean, if we consigned ourselves to people who have actually said, I'm gay, and let's not forget that's an identity label that's only been around, homosexuals only been around for about 150 years, then we wouldn't have much queer history to talk about, would we? But there are obvious sensitivities, and as long as we approach it sensitively, I mean, I'm just looking again at this autobiography, the 6th volume, and I don't know if his partner dies by the end, but they certainly talk about him having a wretched illness brought an end to paradise. And Forward, his partner, is referred to on the back of the book as his manager and friend, and yet it's widely acknowledged that they were in a very long relationship together. So writing, you said, someone who's quite private but wrote several volumes of autobiography, how painful must that have been for him not to actually be completely honest? Or maybe he found it easier not to be completely honest. But I think some of his film choices for a closeted gay man were very curious. Not just the leather trousers and the homoeroticism of the singer, not the song, but probably his most widely viewed film nowadays, because it's just such a landmark work of queer cinema. And I know you've written about this in your article, is Victim.
Yeah, just to quickly go back to something you said actually about the autobiography. He did do an interview in the 80s, and he says in that everything about his private life is everything about me is there in my autobiography for anybody who wants to find it. You just have to read between the lines, which to me is kind of a bit of acknowledgement. So what you're saying about using the word friend. But Victim, I think, is an interesting example because he wasn't out at the time, but there were rumours. There was speculation. You know, he was manager, and there was always kind of rumours really about him. So he chooses to do the film Victim, which really kind of approaches the issue of homosexuality in Britain and the fact that it wasn't legal at the time. And it's quite a powerful film. It is still quite a tough watch. I mean, when I first watched it, I found it quite upsetting. But it was a very interesting role for him to take, particularly because it turned down by several other actors. James Mason turned it down, Jack Hawkins, a few of them, I think.
And there's that famous scene which there's in your article you write about, where essentially Sylvia Sims, who I actually found out in the course of editing the article, she's still alive, legend Sylvia Sims, and there's that confrontation between the two of them. So a wife confronting her husband about essentially him sleeping with a man. And for a film, was that 1961?
Yes.
For a film to have that, you know, 6 years before homosexuality was partially decriminalized, was a really brave move. And especially as you know, James Mason and, as far as I'm aware, Jack Hawkins were both straight identifying men. So for them, but then for an actual gay man, even a closeted one, to take on that role, perhaps even more so for a closeted gay man, was just a really bold move, I think. And I think that you're right. I found that film incredibly uncomfortable to watch, especially what happens, no spoilers, but what happens with the partner. But obviously quite representative of reality at the time, a really sad film, but also quite empowering in some ways. So if people want to check out Victim, I'd really, really recommend it. It isn't an easy watch, even today, perhaps even more so than it was back then. It's really not an easy watch, but it is really, really good. So what's Bogarde got to do with Bond then?
So basically, he was approached when Ian Fleming were coming up with the original version of Thunderball in the late 50s. There's evidence that he was approached to play the part, which would have been a good get at the time, because this is when he's still kind of riding high, sort of a matinee idol. And apparently he was interested. It was very much if dates lined up. I believe his fee was quite high. I can't remember the exact figure. I think I said it in the article. But I think he was probably, I'm not sure if that would have maybe priced him out, but as far as I'm aware, there's nothing further from that. It just kind of, he was approached, he was apparently interested. It was all to do if the dates would have lined up. But I thought the idea of him playing Bond was an interesting springboard to then sort of discuss how, you know, how the things could have been different if he had taken that part, both of the Bond films, and for the fact that he wouldn't have taken the role of Victim, which is this, you know, as you sort of saying, that it is kind of it's a social message film. It's a film that had a point and had an impact, and there is evidence to suggest that it did help towards getting the decriminalisation pushed through. You know, however, in however small a way, but it was something in the zeitgeist. And so I thought, if he'd taken Bond, well, what would that mean for Victim? And also, what would it meant to have had a closeted gay man play that role, both then and to us now, to be able to look back and say, oh, the first ever James Bond was a closeted gay man, and we have all this evidence to suggest that. You've really sort of sent me down a rabbit hole. I think you sent the imagination running wild.
It's a really interesting rabbit hole to go down, and especially where we are at the moment with all the daily casting rumors of James Bond. I was actually talking to a journalist the other day who says that they have on permanent rotation in between bonds, they have or even while the existing Bond is kind of seeing out the last film of their tenure, they have a story always primed, ready to keep putting on their websites. I don't know if you've got one and for your publication. I know that James Bond probably doesn't come across your pages terribly often, much as you.
I try.
You try, get him in wherever. But that's one of the most read articles on most news websites. And even if it keeps just regurgitating the same names over and over again. And I can't help thinking that Dirk Bogarde would have perhaps been a bit like, Henry Cavill or Tom Hardy or Idris Elba, the names that we just keep getting over and over again, none of whom have a chance in hell of actually being cast as James Bond. I hope I'm never going to have to eat those words. But I'm 99.999% certain they're not going to be cast because they are too big, really. Not just the expense, but they're such household names. And that's never really happened with Bond. And it's probably the same sort of situation with Bogarde because he was so big. That was probably the thing that was really counting against him. But
it's interesting. I had a conversation with my partner the other night, and I actually said to him that Henry Cavill is someone I don't want to see as James Bond.
No,
because I think he's so big that you're not going to be watching Bond. You're going to be watching Henry Cavill. And there's an element of that with Bogarde, particularly in his. I don't say less art house because that sounds really pretentious, but in some of his more kind of light comedies, melodramas, there is a sense of him bringing himself to the film, and you're not watching the character, you're watching Bogarde, which is something that's quite common with a lot of actors. And it can be equally appealing. But whether that would have been good for the first Bond film, I don't know. And I do have to say that I think if they had made Thunderball in 58 or 59, whenever it was meant to be, and they'd cast Bogarde, it probably wouldn't. We probably wouldn't be here talking about this.
No.
I don't think it would have really made an impact. I'm not honestly sure if he would have been that good. I mentioned in the article the closest he came is a sort of spy spoof called Hot Enough for June from 1964, which is made as part of like the Euro spy craze that happens after the first few Connery films. So I'm a bit obsessed with Euro spy films. They're counter-trash. I love them. And this is actually one of the better ones. It's quite a tight Cold War thriller, and genuinely quite tense considering it's meant to be a comedy. But it's the closest we've come to him playing Bond. And as much as I like that film, I think he's good in that. I can't. I try and picture him in the Moneypenny series. I try and picture him in talking to Desmond Llewellyn and all the kind of the typical Bond moments. I can't see it because I think he's, as we were saying, a bit like Cavill, a bit too big, a bit too much of a name. People expect to see a certain performance when you go in and see that actor's pretty big.
Yeah, and the fact that he was gay, I don't know how much that would have prevented him from taking on the role, because obviously he played a lot of straight characters, and there's of course nothing stopping a gay actor playing a straight role. But I can't help think of that story, which has made the headlines again, in a fairly unsavory way, regarding George Lazenby. But it's probably how he told the story at that concert more than the story itself, which has been doing the rounds for decades. But the producers apparently sent prostitutes to his hotel room to prove that he wasn't gay. Now, whether that happened exactly as George describes is, largely immaterial, but the idea being that you couldn't have a guy playing James Bond who slept with or was more interested in men than women off screen. And it's that blurring of screen the character and the actor, which I think probably is still a thing today. I don't know how likely it is that we would have a actor who identifies as bisexual or doesn't explicitly identify as straight. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, it's interesting. I just mentioned that I love Eurospy, and I watched a couple last night. And one of the ones I watched was, this is related, was one of the OSS 417 films, 60s. And the first two of those films star an actor called Kerwin Matthews. He's an American actor. He's best known for Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, I think, the Ray Harryhausen, little clay models.
Yeah.
And he's basically playing James Bond. And the scripts are very problematic in places, very, very sexist. But he was gay. He was a gay man. He was in a long-term relationship with, I believe, a display manager at Harvey Nichols, I think, that he met in 1960s.
Oh, right.
Something like that. But he's basically playing James Bond, and he was, it's a great performance. He's actually someone I would have minded being the role. I think he would have been quite good if they wanted to go down the American route. It doesn't matter. He can play the part, and I think it's a shame, really, that there, if the story that George Lazenby told is true. I've heard it before. I think it's in a documentary. If that is true, then it's just a shame, because doubt. I mean, you look at Roger Moore and what he was like in his films and what he was like in real life, and they're completely different.
Oh, totally.
He was not that person.
No.
And to be fair, if he was if Roger Moore was Roger Moore of the Bond films, excuse my French, but he would have been a bit. I don't think anybody would have really liked him.
No.
And it's a shame, really, that I think that something is kind of unimportant to someone's acting ability is their sexuality, and still cast a shadow. And I think it's well the fact that we do have this notion of what James Bond has to be, and I think some of those elements that now I would hope we can move away from that we don't have someone's sexuality is important. What we want from James Bond.
Yeah.
The acting ability, really. But yeah, I would hope that's something that isn't something in the zeitgeist, and people don't expect that from James Bond.
Yeah, I think it would probably be easier, but I don't know. I mean, there are quite a few even A-lister actors nowadays who refuse to be pinned down about their sexual orientation and refuse to put that label on things, and in some ways it sort of keeps more doors open. So if they were to say they're unequivocally straight, then they would get then lambasted for playing gay roles. So I'm thinking of two actors I really admire, like Andrew Garfield and Jack Lowden. They've refused, ostensibly straight in relationships with women when they're pictured at premieres and things like that, but they refuse to put those labels on, and both have played queer roles quite a lot, and it sort of keeps those doors open, which you could say is taking roles away from queer identifying people, but it kind of cuts both ways, doesn't it? And I think it's really, I'm trying to think of a really good example of where you've got an out gay actor who plays a lot of straight characters. I mean, Luke Evans is another one who is thrown into the mix of who could be the next Bond. And he's actually done an interview with Attitude magazine fairly recently, where he was saying, does it really matter if, he's not saying he's in the running for Bond, but does it really matter anymore what someone gets up to in the bedroom outside of the film itself? So I'm kind of hopeful. I think a lot of doors are open for Bond, but for the next Bond, but we're not going to have a big name, are we? I genuinely think most people aren't, when it's announced, most people aren't going to know who that person is.
I mean, probably not, but that's preferable to me.
Yeah.
I prefer sort of a smaller actor, because I think they can then bring something new to the table. There's been a lot in the news recently about. I think there was another interview with Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson the other day, and they were saying, "Oh, really? What we need to decide is not who's going to play him, but what the direction's going to be." And I think if you get a big name, it's harder to then change direction, do something a bit different, a bit unique. Ultimately, that's why we're all here. That's why we all like Bond, because some people love Casino Royale and they like it to be all dark and serious and brooding, and other people love Diamonds because they like it camp. And there we go. And
I like both. They're both in my top 5, but I'm awkward.
I think as well, something that's just worth saying is that obviously, does someone's sexual orientation matter when it comes to James Bond? This idea that you couldn't have a gay man play James Bond. It's interesting because of all the work you've done, but you've spoken about James Bond's kind of sexual ambiguity within the films. So if anything, it might be truer if we're going to go down that route to have someone who doesn't identify as heterosexual. But I'm being a little bit facetious there. But it is that.
No, go on. I'll just pour gasoline on that fire. Yeah, go for it, Callum.
But no, I definitely think that if Bogarde had been Bond, I don't think we would be talking about. We wouldn't be here, basically.
No.
And I think it's the brilliance of taking an actor who is not known, or they've only done a little bit of TV, or they've had a couple of small hit films. Taking them and really kind of working with them to mold the next film. What is the next film? That's why it's quite exciting now, is that we're really on the kind of precipice of a rebirth. And I'm quite excited when they say these comments about, we're reinventing it, which I think caused a bit of anger online.
Yeah, it's amazing. Just, I'm sure Barbara Broccoli chooses her words incredibly carefully, but that one word kind of splintered a lot of people, the Bond Online community, whereas I was like, yes, reinvention.
Yeah.
And other people are like, oh no, it's going to go down. And similar kind of reaction. I think it was only a couple of days ago before recording this, they were saying that it was going to delve more into Bond's personal life and his emotions, and some people were like, no, we want Bond emotionally closed off again, and which he is. It's just that the films have spent a little bit longer exploring some of those issues more explicitly. I always argue those things.
Sensitive use, was that the word?
Oh, was it sensitive?
I think so. I might be wrong there. I feel like that's the word that.
The whole irony of this is, if we were to do Fleming's Bond like it appears on the page, he would be a lot more sensitive than any of the film incarnations. So
I always find the argument of, oh well, it's not true to Fleming, a bit funny, because I just sit there and I just think, have you seen Moonraker?
Yeah.
There's not a lot in that film that feels very Fleming to me. I'm sure people would disagree with me, but I mean, I love Moonraker. It's one of my favorites. But I think as well, it's fine if you don't like the next movie. Like, if they come up with a Bond that isn't for you, and you just sit and think, okay, do you know what, this direction, it's not my kind of thing. It's not my cup of tea. That's okay. But it's fine for you to not like it. But I'm sure we all have our own rankings, and there's going to be a few films at the bottom of everybody's ranking that just aren't for you. Do I want to like bring out my hot takes? GoldenEye. I'm not a fan. I don't really like it. It's
right, a load of people have just stopped listening.
That's it. I'm really sorry. But it's not for me.
No.
And that's okay. And so if the next film isn't for you, that's fine, because the one after that might be, and maybe they'll change direction. Particularly with Craig. Craig in Skyfall is not the same. Craig is in Casino. Connery in Goldfinger is a lot more humorous than he is in Roger and For Your Eyes Only versus Moonraker. Like they change, the films change. It's fine, and I do find it a bit amusing when these kind of one words get jumped on.
Oh, I agree.
Sensitive. He can't be sensitive. I'm sitting there going, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the last thing I just that I want to bring up is Modesty Blaze. So we kind of went sort of what year was Modesty Blaze roughly?
66.
66. So we are sort of going chronologically here. So early career, Victim, and then the Bond pictures are out by this point, and then sort of perhaps partly because of the Bond craze of the mid-60s. I don't know anything about the production history of Modesty Blaze, but obviously it had been a comic series for many years before then. But then this film comes out in 1966, which I only watched very recently because of your article. And if you do want to watch it, in fact, I think the only way you can watch it at the moment is soon as uploaded onto YouTube, because I'm not aware of any Blu-ray or DVD versions. There may be some, but not for the UK. I couldn't find anything. So I watched Modesty Blaze and absolutely loved it. I mean, it is utterly bizarre. The plot is incomprehensible, but then it's a total mood piece. And you've got Dirk Bogarde, again, very brave for a closeted gay man to play someone who is so effeminate in lots of ways, in terms of stereotypes, wearing the most gorgeous clothing that I think I've seen on any character in any film ever. As we alluded to at the start of this, drinking wine from a glass at which at the bottom there is a goldfish swimming around. So it's that sort of world we're in. And actually a lot of it's set in Amsterdam, which I hadn't realized. And I watched it while I was packing for a holiday to Amsterdam. So thank you.
I purposefully didn't mention that. I thought I'll keep that as a surprise.
And this is how seriously I take these things, or not seriously, depending on your point of view. But as soon as we arrived in Amsterdam, I said, right, I recognize that building. That's the one from the opening titles of Modesty Blaze. So we walked to the building. I've got a photo of it somewhere, which I haven't put up, or I might put up when your article goes out, of me standing by that building, which doesn't look like much actually in real life, but on film it looks really modern and released in the 1960s. So what are your thoughts on Modesty Blaze?
I was going to make a really niche joke about ringing doorbells in Amsterdam there, but for anyone who hasn't seen Modesty Blaze, that's just not right.
Yes, definitely. In fact, that building, I know that a lot of those buildings look similar. I did have to do a side-by-side comparison. If you just watch the first 5 minutes of Modesty Blaze on YouTube, you'll know exactly what we're talking about. But that building that something happens to in the first few minutes looks very similar superficially to Tiffany Casey's house in Amsterdam. It's not the same building, because I did do a side-by-side, but I thought, oh, is that the same building? It's not. But I can't help thinking that the producers of Diamonds Are Forever used Amsterdam as a location 5 years later because it had featured so prominently in Modesty Blaze, which also concerns missing diamonds.
I mean, I wish that would be true, and I do love that both these kind of spy thrillers are two of the campest probably ever made, and both are set in Amsterdam. But how do you explain Modesty Blaze?
There's no point trying to explain the story.
No, I mean, well, there isn't one, but it's quite similar to sort of. I think I always go down the route like Barbarella, if you've seen that, or Danger Diabolic, which is another kind of sort of same sort of route. Bit of 60s Batman. It's that kind of high pop art, very high camp. Nothing makes sense. It isn't meant to. There's a lot of fourth wall breaking, which is very funny. It is, again, it's in that kind of Euro spy. It's sort of a reaction to James Bond. It's probably a bit closer to Austin Powers, really. It's a fairly good comparison. But basically, Modesty Blaze is a super criminal who is hired by the British government to try and stop Dirk Bogarde's evil villain Gabriel from stealing some diamonds. That's kind of the long and short of it, but don't go in expecting a kind of crime thriller because
No.
But yeah, Bogarde's incredibly camp. But what's interesting about it is that I believe that he was asked by the director, who was Joseph Losey, who's a director he worked with a few times, particularly on 1963's The Servant, which is my favourite film of all time. And Losey basically said to Bogart, "Oh, this character, Gabriel, this villain, do what you want to do." And so Bogart actually, as far as I'm aware, introduced a lot of these elements, which is intriguing then, that he chooses to play this character exceedingly kind of coded, I think.
There's a point where obviously there's degrees of coding, queer coding. I write about this a lot. And it's really a spectrum of, you really have to kind of strain to see the potentially queer elements. And then there's the other end of the spectrum. And we're definitely on that end of the spectrum in this film.
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about mother a lot, which is sort of like, that's a thing that kind of turns up in these films, sort of 60s, 50s movies. And it is, yeah, it's very strange. I'm not sure whose idea it was to put him in a bleach blonde wig. I love that. And one of my favorite scenes is when he then whips the wig off because he's going to go do a fight scene. And so he's just, now it's serious, like the blonde is gone, which is very strange. Yeah, I mean, I discovered Monty Blaze just before COVID hit, really. I don't think it was lockdown, but it kind of became the perfect like Zoom watch party film. So it was always that because everyone would find it on YouTube. And I don't actually think I've ever seen it sober. And I might advise that,
Probably wise.
yeah, if you're going to go in, maybe don't go in sober. It is just a movie that I think it's very fun. It's not liked really. It's kind of I think I'm probably alone in the Modesty Blaze fan club, at least for the film. But it's really not liked. People really don't like it.
The only other supporter I'm aware of is, the critic does that really brilliant program on Radio 3, Sound of Cinema, which I've been listening to for years. Matthew Sweet is a Bogarde super fan, and really he's referred to Modesty Blaze quite a few times on his Sound of Cinema program. So when I read your article for the first time, I was like, I've been meaning to watch this for years. So I'm so glad that I did, and I'm so glad that you introduced me to it.
Good, and more people need to see it. That's the entire point of that article. Is everybody go and watch Modesty Blaze.
That's it. You could have just saved 3,000 words by just putting that as the title, and we could have just gone with that.
I mean, Modesty Blaze as well. I'm a big fan of the 60s, as I mentioned, I keep saying it, the Euro spy films. And I think if you're a Bond fan, it's worth kind of just dipping your toes into some of the films that were made around the same time. Deadlier Than the Male is another one that's quite accessible. Richard Johnson is in that, who was, I think, Terence Young's first choice for Bond, I think. And that's kind of a really fun sort of camp film. I think particularly in terms of if it's high camp you want, like, just dip your toes into some of these 60s kind of Bond knockoffs, because they're all mostly terrible, but therein lies the pleasure. Like they're so bad, they are amazing. Modesty Blaze, I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. Here I am saying it's a bit like Barbarella. That's not going to prepare you.
No, it really won't. No. So our recommendation: pour yourself a stiff beverage with or without goldfish in the glass, and enjoy Modesty Blaze. Before we go, is there anything else you just want to discuss from the article, Callum?
No, I think we've covered it. I mean, yeah, I hope that people are slightly more interested in sort of checking the Bond fans in particular, just as a kind of interesting sort of what if. I guess if I could do a little sort of films I'd recommend, definitely Sing Another Song
Mm.
Bill that with Modesty Blades. That's a good little package. The Servant, which I mentioned before, it's my favorite film. I think that's a really, it's quite disturbing in places. It's not a horror film, but it's close. It's quite an intense sort of psychological thriller. It's written by Harold Pinter. I think once you say that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I really do need to watch that one.
Definitely Victim. Death in Venice. I'm not really a big fan of that, but it is kind of.
I only watched that last year, and mostly because I love the piece of Mahler that's played continuously. So if you don't like Mahler, don't watch that film. So I've always loved that piece of music. So that's why I watched it. And I have actually read the novella that it's based on, which I didn't love, to be perfectly frank. Maybe I'm just not clever enough to kind of get Thomas Mann. Yeah, and it's not the most comfortable watch, is it? But I did sort of enjoy it for what it was.
Yeah, I mean, it's very highly respected. I think it wasn't really for me. There was a documentary that came out. I really can't remember off the top of my head what it's called, but it was basically about the young man who plays the boy in the film.
Oh yes, yeah.
Most beautiful boy in the world. That's what it's called. And that I think that's an interesting watch, but also it kind of makes it more comfortable, really.
Oh really?
So but he's great in it. Dirk Bogarde is really good, and it is one of his sort of landmark performances. But I mean,
that's 5 films. We're up to 5 because I completely forgotten about Death in Venice.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think if you want to get into that, I'll Victim, Servant, Modesty Blades is just kind of a rate.
Yeah, and Singer, not the song. If you really want to go out there.
Would you want to see him in leather? Like, why would you not?
Well, all the publicity shots for that film are something else. You just can't imagine any film having publicity shots like that nowadays.
I might be wrong, but apparently he only wore the leather because the studio cast John Mills and he didn't get on with John Mills. And he said to the director, that if you cast him, I'm going to do everything I can to ruin this film. And the way he chose to do that was to wear leather trousers and constantly talk about them to the press, which I kind of love.
It's like, I'm going to queer the whole experience for everybody.
But no, Singing Not the Song, definitely. Double bill it with Modesty Blades, like that's a good, Dirk Bogarde's camp classics. That's the Batman.
Do you think he might have made a good Bond villain if he wasn't so expensive? Because the Bond films, contrary to popular belief, have never had humongous budgets compared to other films of their scales.
I mean, yeah, I wouldn't have minded him. Possibly not in the 60s. Although, I mean, if they were going to do Golden Gun early on, it might have been an interesting Scaramanga. But I think in the 70s, it might have been an interesting kind of foil for Roger Morris. Particularly sort of, I'm thinking around the kind of the Moonraker period. There's quite an intense presence versus Roger's kind of slightly more jovial. Sort of
yeah.
I love Michael Lonsdale, but for me, one of the biggest kind of I wish it happened is James Mason as Hugo Draft.
Yeah, definitely.
Mason and Bogart have a lot of kind of similarities in terms of their acting styles. They're quite similar, I think. So I think he would have made a great film. I wouldn't have minded him as M, which is a bit of a weird one, but he retired in '78, and he could be a bit of a prickly personality. So I don't think signing on to a long series is something he would have done.
No.
I mean, just take him out of Modesty Blades and put him in You Only Live Twice. Like, I would love that. Gabriel versus Connery, that'd be amazing.
My favorite scene in Modesty Blaze. It's not really, you can't really do spoilers for Modesty Blaze because the plot makes no sense. But is when he is speculating as to whether they were about to blow this plane out of the sky, and he's speculating as to whether the pilots have kids and families, and then when he learns they do, it's like, I can't remember the dialogue exactly, but he just gets really upset that he's like, oh, and then next second it's like, oh well. It's like, it's so horrible but also so funny at the same time.
There's something about one of the lines, something like a split level housing in Woking with a rubber plant in the lounge, which I think is just like that is, for some reason, it doesn't sound funny when I'm saying it now, but in the context of that scene, it is my favorite scene. I also, shout out to the moment when he keeps getting loads of plates of like really extravagant food brought over, and then he just goes, oh, take it away, and that happens consistently. There's a very funny bit with the lobster.
Yes.
I mean, it's just bizarre. I really would love, like, we need at least a 3-hour documentary on this, plus several books. How was it made? Basically, it's so strange. But I would love to have seen that, him playing that character in a Bond film would be amazing.
So if you haven't done so already, make sure you read Callum's brilliant article about Dirk Bogarde. And then as soon as you've done that, go over to YouTube and watch Modesty Blaze. That's what we're saying, isn't it, Callum?
100%.